Welcome back to another edition of Recruiting Blitz. I'm Tim Verghese, as always. Before we get started, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel. For all of these videos, drop directly into your feed. Our recruiting show, the Nebraska football show, our rapid recaps, press conference videos, and more, as well as Steve's Black Shirt breakdown will all be dropped directly in your feed. All you got to do is subscribe. We recently crossed 10K subscribers. We're trying to hit 15K. So do your part to help us out. Yeah, if you appreciate what you're watching, please give us some feedback as well. We like to hear what you like, what you don't like. And we're not going to waste too much time. Going to get right into it. Nebraska's back at home this week, facing Wisconsin, looking for that ever evasive sixth win. Probably the best chance for them to get it. We'll have more on that game tomorrow in the Nebraska football show with Steve. But in the meantime, we're talking recruiting and kind of what this weekend means. Um, Before we get too further into the game talk and the visit weekend talk, do want to discuss Nebraska's latest addition, flipping four-star outside linebacker Dawson Merritt from Alabama last week. That was a big land for Nebraska. Merritt's a kid. If we were to pick which three or even two recruits we've talked about the most this cycle, Dawson Merritt's certainly in contention for one of the recruits we've talked about the most in this 2025 cycle. He's been one of Nebraska's top priorities since the spring. Was offered way back in last year. There were times back in the spring where it felt like Nebraska was a school to beat. But different programs made runs. At one time, it was Oklahoma. At one point, schools closer to home like Missouri and others had a fair shot. Alabama made not even a late surge, but had maintained a presence and really started to surge in the weeks leading up to his official visits over the summer. And ultimately he did take official visits to Nebraska and Alabama, committed to Alabama over Nebraska over the summer. We said at the time, the Crimson Tide kind of slightly edged Nebraska out at the time, and Nebraska was not going to slow down their pursuit, even despite losing out initially. And they got him back on campus for the Colorado game earlier this year, impressed him with the environment, impressed him with the play in that game. I think over the course of the season, Tony White's defense and the opportunity, specifically as a linebacker, to kind of play fast and loose, really stuck out to him. He mentioned when we went out to see him last month. He mentioned just how much he watches Nebraska's defense, and every single week he was watching Nebraska and Alabama, kind of gauging between both schools, like which felt more at home, which felt like the school for him, and as much as he liked the plan Alabama had for him and liked the plan Nebraska had for him. Ultimately, it came down to not just the on-field plan at both schools, but the off-field relationships. At Alabama, he has a good relationship with his what would have been his future positions coach, and a few other coordinators there. But at Nebraska, from the summer, pretty much, it's Nebraska had done a really good job of establishing connections with them from the top down, from Matt Rule down to Tony White, down to Rob Dvorak, down to some off-field assistants, down to recruiting assistants, the strength and conditioning coaches, the nutrition program, people within the nutrition program, people on the academic side of things, and even players. Dylan Raiola, members of the linebacker room, Vincent Shavers, young guys in the building, former players, Prince Amukamara, Cam Taylor Britt, et cetera, all played their part in helping Nebraska win this recruitment and land Dawson Merritt. And now, Nebraska has a linebacker room, or a young linebacker room now, that you can kind of hang your hat on and say, hey, this is one of the better units on our team. For Rob Dvorak, he's got Vincent Shavers and Willis McGahee currently. He's going to add Christian Jones, Dawson Merritt, and Pierce Newberry to that room next year. Those five young guys, those contend for a real talented linebacker room that can do a lot of different things. Those guys can line up at a couple of different places. Obviously, Willis kind of occupies the jack position. Vincent more of an inside linebacker. Christian Jones and Dawson Merritt can line up inside and out. Pierce Newberry can do the same. And those guys I think have a bright future at Nebraska, and I think that Nebraska's defensive strength eventually the goal is it just seems just with the talent they have there is in that front seven, with the talents coming in on the D line and with the talent they're bringing in at linebacker. As for what's next, Dawson's going to make it up this weekend for the Wisconsin game. It's going to be his first time back in town since committing, and his first time back in town since that Colorado game back in September. He's a headliner just as a commit returning. Nebraska's going to have a good group of commits back in town as well. 2027 quarterback Trey Taylor is going to be back in town. Remember, he visited last month and then actually got to see Nebraska play Ohio State because he was visiting Ohio State at the time and will be back in Nebraska this week. His third visit to Nebraska, basically his third time seeing Nebraska this year, his second true visit to Nebraska in the last few months. And I think Nebraska, again, has a real shot there, battling some of the who's who's across the country. But Nebraska quickly emerging as like a top priority for him and vice versa. This is going to be his first opportunity to meet Dana Holgorsen and have conversation with him and get an idea of what Nebraska's vision is offensively moving forward with or without Dana Holgorsen. Um, and so that's another big visit coming into the weekend. I think Nebraska's going to get a couple other 27s in town, top guys that they've offered recently. 2076. You're going to see some names getting into town. A couple Midwest DBs they've already offered, already looking at visits. A couple guys that have not had the opportunity to visit Nebraska this fall are going to be back in town. But the real focus, I think, this weekend is the 2025 class and who makes it into town. We're about 2 weeks out from signing day. Nebraska's kind of putting the finishing touches here. This is the last like game day opportunity before signing day to get guys in town. And I don't know how much of an opportunity Nebraska's going to have to make any other visits before signing day. So this is really it for them with this 2025 class. So a couple of names I would say to keep an eye on. Jordan Allen, three-star receiver out of Buford, currently committed to Louisville. He made an official visit to Georgia Tech a couple of weeks ago. Would not be surprised to see him at Nebraska this week, either on an unofficial or an official visit, likely joined by Dayton Raiola. Wouldn't be surprised to see him in town. He's an electric returner. He's been young Dayton Raiola's favorite go-to target this year at Buford. A deep threat, a guy that's a little on the shorter end, 5'8", but can really take the top off a defense. And a guy that can make you pay, with his legs. And so Nebraska's hoping to get him in town. That's one to keep an eye on. And I would also keep an eye, is there a chance Michael Terry makes it into town? The four-star wide receiver target out of Texas. Nebraska's making their final push here, as this recruitment kind of heads into its final stretch. There was at a point where this felt like this was going to get shut down before the season. There's a time where it felt like this was going to get shut down in October. Now we're in late November, heading into signing day. It sounds like this is going to be a signing day commitment. And with where Nebraska stands right now, they're closing that gap on Texas. A win this past week against USC would have been nice to kind of help their chances a little bit, show that they're making some progress. But the Huskers fell short this week. We'll have to see if they can get to that point. But again, Terry's another one. It's worth keeping an eye on and seeing if he makes it into town. It's just coming down to Nebraska and Texas. Texas has done everything right in this recruitment, as has Nebraska. Nebraska's making him think really long and hard kind of about what he wants to do moving forward. He's had every opportunity to commit to Texas. Texas has been the most competitive when it comes to NIL. Texas has been the most aggressive in the last few months, just in terms of making him feel like a priority and letting him know kind of that he's got a spot and they'll make it work for him no matter what he wants to play and where he wants to play. But that's a change, from what their pursuit was early in that recruitment to what it is now. But for Nebraska, what's kept Nebraska in this is their consistency. From the jump, he's been a priority from Nebraska. From the moment Nebraska offered, Nebraska was one of the first to offer him, and from that moment, he's been a top priority. They've told him he's going to be a focal point in the offense. They've told him he's going to get taken care of at Nebraska. He's got good relationships from Matt Rule down to offensive staff members, down to Keith Williams, down to off-field staff members, et cetera, et cetera. He's got guys like Isaiah Mosey working to recruit him, Jamar Mosey, Dylan Raiola. There's a bunch of names working here. And, as Nebraska tries to close this gap and potentially, jump Texas here in these final couple of weeks, getting him back on campus would go a long ways in doing that. So that's another one just worth keeping an eye on heading into this final stretch. I'm not sure if he's going to visit, but another just name as we're kind of turning that page and are looking at this end of this 2025 cycle. Another name to keep an eye on the defensive side of the ball, Aiden Manutai, three-star safety out of Hawaii, committed to Cal over Nebraska over the summer. departure of Evan Cooper kind of resulted in him in Cal's late surge. Cal also made an aggressive NIL offer over the summer to kind of jump Nebraska very late in that recruitment. But Nebraska stayed persistent. Donovan Raiola went out to Hawaii over the bye week to go see Aiden, and now Nebraska, in well positioned to pull off that flip before signing day, if not on signing day. So that's one to keep an eye on as we head into these final weeks of the 2025 class. That's about it for the defensive side of the ball for the most part right now. I guess another name to, if you want to keep an eye on something, Martels Carter, a Kentucky four-star commit. Tried to make it in town 2 weeks ago for the UCLA game, couldn't get into town, couldn't get a flight. Said he was going to try for the Wisconsin game. If that happens, I'd keep an eye on Nebraska as a potential school to flip. But if Nebraska can't get him in town, I just don't think that's going to happen. Nebraska tried and has maintained good communication there. That may be one where if Nebraska doesn't get him now, they may have to try again if Carter does enter the transfer portal at some point in his college tenure. Um, but yeah, like I said, that's about it for the defensive recruiting in 2025. I think for the most part, linebacker recruiting is for sure done. Defensive line recruiting practically done. In the secondary, they're kind of looking at Manutai. They're looking at Carter. If they can find another DB, they'd like that. But at this point, they're probably going to turn the attention to the transfer portal, get ahead there. And when the transfer portal does open, I'd expect them to be aggressive, specifically getting back end defenders because they really need an influx of athleticism there. And right now they have some young athletes that down the line, could contribute for this team and could give Nebraska a nice athletic burst or athletic boost in the back end of the secondary. But those guys are just young and still figuring it out. And so, at this point, it's like how ready are those guys? We don't know, which is why it feels like they're leaning towards getting into the transfer portal and addressing some of their needs at safety, and even at nickel, via the transfer portal. Up front, you could see some transfer portal additions on the D line. I'm not expecting any linebacker transfer portal additions right now, but if they find one they like, it wouldn't surprise me if they at least make a swing. But on the D line, you have to replace Ty Robinson, you have to replace Nash Hotmacher. That's not going to be easy, and I think Nebraska is going to have to see what they can do in the portal. But interior D line is the hardest position to find in the transfer portal, just in terms of how many quality players do enter the portal and are available, and how hard it is to land those guys because those guys are the ones that usually drive a high NIL number. On the offensive side of the ball, Nebraska's taking some last minute swings on some offensive tackles and offensive linemen across the country. See if there's something out there at this point. Just with the offensive play this year, I don't think there's an offensive tackle or an elite offensive lineman out there that is looking at Nebraska as a school to potentially flip to at this point. But um, again, that's another position I wouldn't be surprised to see them address in the transfer portal, whether that's just bolstering depth, trying to find like a quality tackle starter, trying to find some quality start like guys that can start or at least provide some quality depth through the portal. I think that's where we're at, where Nebraska's at right now, is just trying to find quality depth and quality starters and being picky with spots. But O-line, for the most part, you're not really going to see any more high school additions there. They are keeping an eye on, Brian Tapu, the three-star O-line commit out of Utah, just to make sure that he signs. There's some West Coast schools pushing there, trying to make a late run at him. But I think Nebraska's going to be able to hang on to his signature. At receiver, we've mentioned already Michael Terry and Jordan Allen, two that they're trying to get. Another one that would also put on potentially visit watch this weekend. Nebraska's still in it for Cortez Mills, a name that we've talked about, almost just as much as Dawson Merritt over the course of the cycle. A guy that, at one point in the spring, Nebraska felt like the leader in that recruitment. Then Nebraska kind of slipped behind schools like Clemson, schools like Florida, schools like Miami. And then Oklahoma surged at one point. And Oklahoma was able to land his commitment over the summer after getting him in town for an official visit. That was a bit of a surprise, seeing how fast Oklahoma made up that ground and surged. And with Oklahoma kind of struggling to find their footing in the SEC, and with Nebraska having some playing time available, and the consistent pursuit of Dylan Raiola and Garrett McGuire and Matt Rule and some of the coaching staff, Nebraska, again, this is another one where I guess on Oklahoma's side, they kind of view him as a flight risk, a guy that they don't expect, or are like kind of not really expecting to sign with them at this point. Whether it's Nebraska or someone else at this point, it just kind of feels like that's a recruitment that's up in the air right now. And again, wouldn't necessarily surprise me to see him in town this weekend either, getting one final look at Nebraska or potentially one final look at Oklahoma or another school. I wouldn't be surprised if Clemson finds their way back into that recruitment. Florida's throwing some money around in the NIL side of things. Do they find themselves back in that recruitment? Does Florida State make a run? There's some opportunity here for some other schools to get involved. But as things currently stand, I think Nebraska is well positioned um, to flip Cortez Mills. So keep an eye on that. That's three pass catchers out there. Nebraska's still working on, and again, even if they land all three, I don't know if they land all three. I think if you look at it right now, I think it's a safe bet they land at least one of the three. But if they don't land, if they land, even if they land all three or two of the three or however many of that group they land, I do expect Nebraska to once again be aggressive and trying to land some playmakers in the transfer portal, guys that can stretch the field and get things going for Dylan Raiola. Nebraska's had an issue beating man coverage this year and kind of creating some separation downfield. You're trying to find guys that can do that, and obviously that's going to be tough. But every year, wide receiver and cornerback, those are two positions where you can find guys in the portal. There are options in the portal there. Nebraska just needs to find the right fit. And we can talk all we want about kind of who they have on the roster now, but I don't necessarily know if they found the right fits last year. They found guys that can make plays, but within what the offense they want to do and what they want to be. Again, in retrospect, hindsight's 2020, but I don't necessarily know if they found the right fits in those offensive playmaker spots. One other pass catcher worth keeping an eye on here in this final stretch of the 2025 cycle, Chase Loftin, the in-state four-star tight end. He'll be playing for a state championship at Memorial Stadium next week on Monday, November 25th. Obviously, a big game between Millard South and West Side here in Nebraska. Though two teams that have felt, kind of on this inevitable path to meet each other in the state championship, and now they're there. As Loftin is working on that, he's also balancing his recruitment, committed to Florida State, but obviously Florida State having a very disappointing season, a season that could end, about as poor as you can ask for, coming off of a pretty much an undefeated regular season. And he's kept his options open. He visited Nebraska for that UCLA game. After that game, we kind of talked about it and kind of mentioned, Nebraska had an opportunity there to slam the door on that recruitment and pull off that flip. They've kept that door open, unfortunately, and so now you're seeing Missouri re-enter the picture. You're seeing Texas A&M re-enter the picture. He's going to get down to Florida State here at the end of the year, and so this is a recruitment that is not over yet, and a recruitment that Nebraska had a chance to kind of finish off, and now there's an opportunity for some other schools to get involved. I think Nebraska's going to do their best here in these final few weeks to try and pull off a flip, but they've got to show some serious offensive improvement, and I don't think the performance against USC is enough to show Loftin that Nebraska's on the up and ups in terms of offensive trajectory. Beyond that, I think when you're talking what's left for the offense to address here in this cycle, on the O line, it's practically done here in the high school recruiting at wide receiver. We mentioned those three names plus Chase Loftin at tight end. At running back, they're pretty much done with high school recruiting. They have two running back commits. And would they find one in the transfer portal at this point? We'll see. It really just depends on who's in there. I think if Nebraska's going to go and get one, they're going to try and find like a game-changing back, a guy that could truly be a bell cow back. Obviously, quarterback is addressed. TJ Lateef is committed and set to sign next month and 2 weeks at this point. Technically next month, but sign here in 2 weeks. And we'll be on campus in January. Nebraska's we're going to get a full list of the early enrollees together come signing day. I think some of those guys are still figuring some last minute paperwork out and making sure they're on track. But obviously, we're also trying to make sure see what Nebraska has to do before signing day in terms of guys that are potentially flipping out, guys that are flipping in. Still a lot of movement ahead. And to close here, Nebraska's sitting here at 5-5, an opportunity, in these next two games to potentially get to that bowl game, something they need to do. I think I've said this all season on the show, to get to where Nebraska wants to get, both on the recruiting trail and on the field, wins matter, and showing progress matters. And they could talk all they want about what they provide off the field and all of that. And Nebraska is going to have that draw because of the facilities, because of the way Matt Rule and his staff treat players and recruits, because of the camaraderie of the team, because of so many different things. Nebraska is always going to have something of a draw. For them to get to where they want to, for them to make that leap in year 3 that they want to, in year 4, and so on and so forth, and for Matt Rule to have the runway that he wants at Nebraska, winning here in these next 2 games is more important than anything. Doesn't matter who they land here in 2 weeks on signing day. Doesn't matter who signs. Doesn't matter who they land in the transfer portal. If you can't win these next 2 weeks, at least one game, if you can't make a bowl game here this season after starting the season the way you did, it's a tough sell. It's tough not just to sell the players, but to sell the fan base, but to sell the donors, to keep the money coming in from the NIL standpoint, to keep the support coming in from the quote unquote the best fan base in the world. Like to have all of that. At some point the return has to pay off, and Nebraska, it hasn't paid off yet, and so it's do or die time, and it's time for this team, and for Matt Rule and his team to kind of get that 6th win, get that kind of monkey off their back, so to speak, and take that next step as a program, and if they can't do that, then I think you face an offseason where you have some real tough questions to ask. And you really have to figure out, like, hey, how does this program take that next step? How does the program get over that hump? Because they have not been able to do it since 2016 for a reason. And, no matter how much changes, whether it's the head coach, whether it's players, personnel, it always seems to be the same results. And again, I understand, like, the fan base is frustrated. Everyone's frustrated. But, you get that 6th win. And you can kind of see the hope starting to come back in, the light starting to come back in. You can see, what that can do for your program. Nebraska hasn't had those extra winter practices, those bowl practices in a really long time. They haven't had that since 2016. Getting that back would be so big for the program. Getting those type of practices back for the young guys that all they need is development. All they need is more opportunity. The bowl game doesn't count against the redshirt number. You can play whoever you want. It'd be an opportunity to get some young guys in. I say all that to say, just getting a bowl game this year is so important for Nebraska, and should be the final focus. Even here, we're 2 weeks out from signing day. There's a lot on the coaching staff's mind, but getting this 6th win is of the utmost priority for the long-term success of the program.